This is the title of my talk. The subtitle is music composition and creating mathematics, but I think that's a lot more boring. So as an introduction, I want to pose the following question. How does one learn something complex? And let's recall the distinction between that which is complex and that which is hard. So something which is complex involves many different things. So it's highly connected to lots of different stuff. And those different things are relevant to the concept at hand. Whereas something which is hard is something which is very far away from your current state of knowledge, right? So we have the following table as a few examples. So complex would be composing music using software instruments. This requires just so many different moving components, and it is simply a nightmare to learn even just one of them, but more on that later. And then an example of something that would be hard would be playing an instrument to a high level. So you can see that we have this subjectivity behind that which is hard, but a relative objectivity, forgive the oxymoron, to that which is complex. So playing an instrument to a very high level could be perfectly easy for somebody that has already gone through that journey and just is simply able to play an instrument to a high level. That means that that is not hard to them. It's easy because it's close to their current state of knowledge. But then there would be something else that that person finds hard that they haven't put in that history of practice for. These are two musical examples. And then to give mathematical examples would be something complex could be a simple duality or simple to prove duality. So the concrete example is that I have is the Curry-Howard isomorphism. So at least the way that I am most familiar with this theorem, and for those who don't know, this is an important theorem that gives a foundational relationship between theoretical computer science and formal logic. It's a nightmare of a theorem to get through, but that's because there are so many components involved in it. So you have to understand this very complicated equivalence relation, which has many, many different generators. And there are many different reasons why these generators are there. And each individual one of them is completely easy. There's nothing difficult about comprehending each individual one, but there are so many, and the combination of all of them together is necessary for this theorem to hold, that it becomes something which is very complex, but it's not necessarily hard. And then a mathematical example of something that is very hard would be constructing a proof which has a trick inside it. So a proof with a trick. So you can see there's that subjectivity once again. If you know what the trick is, then this is not something which is very far away from your current state of knowledge, and so therefore it's easy for you. But if you don't know the trick, it can be very, very difficult in order to construct this trick and to just kind of invent it on your own. So I was going to put any exercise in Hartshorne's famous/infamous textbook, Algebraic Geometry, is a good example of that which is hard. So you have to sit down, and sometimes there is only one idea which is relevant, but to construct that idea is really requires a moment of inspiration. Okay, so that gives you a distinction between that which is complex and that which is hard. And so the question is, how do we learn something which is complex, right? And the reason why this is a relevant question is I have the strong belief that passively reading large bodies of theory is boring and ineffective. Now, I have met people who would definitely disagree with this. They're very happy to sit down and just learn every single definition in the entire textbook of Hartshorne, and they have a merry old time while they're doing that. But I am not one of those people. I find it. Well, let me put it this way. There was a quote from my auntie, who is also scheduled to talk inside this seminar series. I wonder if she'll say this same line. But she has this thing that she likes to say. It is impossible to learn something irrelevant to you. So maybe impossible is being a bit too brutal, but whatever, let's stick with it. It's impossible to learn something irrelevant to you. So how could something be relevant to you? So it could be relevant to you if it's highly, highly interesting, or if it solves a problem of yours, or if it gains you some kind of benefit. And what is good about being in that position is that you are absolutely prime to absorb knowledge, right? So, say you were trying to compose some music using software instruments. Now, you might find that even changing the frame rate or the beats per minute or the time signature or something else completely basic like that, you might find that so unbelievably difficult and it will cause you so much pain. You are sitting there clicking everything and you're like, why on earth is this not just so goddamn simple, but I can't do it? So at that point in time, you're in pain. And so if somebody were to come in and just tell you, oh, the way that you do the thing that you're trying to do is like this, then that will relieve you of pain. And that means that you're going to pay very acute attention to that person telling you that, right? And you're much more likely to pay attention to that when you're in that state of being than if you were walking down the street and you had no relationship to software music whatsoever. If somebody were to come up to you and they said, if you're ever using the software Ableton Live, then the way that you can change the time signature is like this. You're going to forget that information because it's irrelevant to you. So part of learning something complex is to make what you're learning relevant, okay? So let's put that down as an axiom. And that might seem like a tautology, but the reason why it's not is because you kind of want to look at the complement of this statement. So that which is not relevant, but is still part of the complex thing that you're trying to learn, you can go ahead and ignore it. And so how do you have this guiding light of what do I ignore and what do I pay attention to? Well, the answer to that is you set yourself a goal. You set yourself a project. So, for example, the way that I learned anything about developing music using software is I just decided that I wanted to create a solo album. I've always been interested in writing music and I got fed up with relying on other people. So I decided, let's just do it myself. And I was met with the world of software instruments because I don't play enough instruments to be able to just record everything on my own. And also, I didn't want to do that. And also, this was during COVID, so I wasn't even able to do it, etc. So it was during the COVID lockdowns, I should say. And the way that I learned anything was I said, I'm just going to write an album, right? I'm just going to start with nothing and I'm going to end with an album which I can post on Spotify and that I can send to my friends. I'm going to end with a physical thing, right? And there is a massive journey in between there. So if I draw a little diagram, this is me when I have nothing. This is me when I have an album, and there's a journey, and the journey looks like this. Well, that's a very optimistic drawing of the path. It's much more like that. But anyway, let's go with this drawing. And you'll find that there are hurdles along the way. So here's the first hurdle, which is creating a new project. And here is another hurdle, and it's doing something sophisticated like equalizers or adding reverb or other alternative sounds. And then there's even more over here. Maybe you do want to do some recording of some description, and I've got absolutely no idea how to do that. I might not even have access to the equipment that's necessary. And then honestly, these hurdles, they just keep coming. Then there's the actual release of the music, etc. And what is nice about this method is you're intentionally running into these hurdles, right? And the reason why you're intentionally running into these hurdles is because you can harvest the hurdles for questions. So when you run into the first hurdle, creating a new project, you're immediately hit with questions. You are harvesting questions from this hurdle. You're saying, what possibilities are out there? What type of project do I want? What do I want it to sound like? What do I want to do with it? What are the possibilities out there? And once you have these questions, you can then go to your resource with those questions, be that resource an online tutorial, a textbook, a course, a friend, an online blog, or just random experimentation yourself. Whatever method you're going to do to try to answer those questions, the point is that's not the hard part. Answering questions is easy, right? You just got to work out the answer. What is hard is developing the correct questions to try and chase the answer to, okay? So really what's going on in the peripheral is there's kind of this outer ring of stuff, and it incorporates more than just the questions and the hurdles, and it incorporates more than just the answers to those questions. It incorporates all of that plus a little bit on the peripheral, and everything inside this green region is what you end up learning, okay? And then on the outside is everything that there is to know.
So if problems are so great, why do people ever give up?
You might find the problem too hard, you might find it annoying, you might have other mental barriers that stop you from being able to finish the projects that you start. There are many different reasons why.
I'm not
I think
stuck.
that
I'm just harvesting.
yeah, exactly. It's just harvesting. Well, I think one of the key points that I want to make in today's talk is that I think developing music and also developing mathematics, I think any creative project is completely intertwined with the self. So learning how to get past these hurdles is part of learning the self. And so you might be somebody that just sits there harvesting questions on hurdles forever. And you might be doing that because you're scared of failure and you never knew that about yourself. And then as you go further into this project, you start unlayering these uncomfortable sides of yourself and you realize this. Or maybe you do it because you're a perfectionist, or maybe you do it because you're thorough. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative reason why you're doing that. But this harvesting of questions is going to end up giving you more than what you bargained for. At the very least, that's been my experience with it. And after talking to other artists and other creators, they tend to say the same. So you're revealing part of yourself as you're developing these creative projects. And I think that's, in fact, to be encouraged, because the artistic process is a crucial part of the art itself. So there are many different reasons why you might get stuck. But one of the best lessons that I got in my mathematical education, this is from Arun Ram. He simply said, the goal is to not get stuck. And that's what students say. They said, I was working on the question, but I got stuck. Well, the goal is to not get stuck. So if you're stuck, why are you stuck? How could we get unstuck? What could it look like if this problem was a tree? How would you climb it? You know, whatever stupid thing you need in order to just keep making movement is a beneficial thing. So I think you're inherently going to end up battling parts of self when you battle a creative project. Anyway, to finish this diagram, the green region is what you learn. Okay. And if you talk to anybody who has done something to a very, very high level, who you think is very impressive, I am highly certain that they will give you something similar to this diagram, in that no one knows everything. That's not possible. But you forge this green region inside the blue. And then the point of having multiple experts is that you have multiple different green blobs inside the blue. And then those green blobs can interact with each other and they can both develop each other's green blobs, etc. And this is really the way that you learn things. Like nobody knows algebraic geometry and nobody knows Reaper, the program, or Ableton Live, but instead you know some subset of it due to past endeavors that were guided by that which was relevant to you. Okay. Let me move on to the next period. Part 2, the feedback loop. Between mathematics and music. So, one thing that I found very interesting as a musician when I was studying mathematics is mathematics has a crushing strictness to originality. So if you come up with an idea, but it's already been thought of, too bad. You get basically nothing for that. Nothing. You get no money for that. You get other stuff from it, but you don't get money for that. So a typical experience is a mathematician will think very, very hard and they'll do a lot of mathematics and then they'll discover something only to find that the result was already proven elsewhere. Now, this can be painful as a mathematician, but in my opinion, this attitude is painfully absent inside the discipline of music. So I haven't prepared this, but believe me, I could. I could play for you 5 different songs from 5 different countries across 5 different decades where you literally would not be able to tell that I've even played something different. If I just played you those 30-second samples, you would say, Will, you played and repeated the exact same thing 5 times, but they are different countries, different cultures, different people, different bands, different decades. It's mind-blowing and really quite devastating how homogenous and repetitive some music is. So in particular, I'm a heavy metal musician, and there's a reason why I say that, but we can talk about that later. But I identify as a heavy metal musician, and this genre of music is just not okay, man. Like you can go to bars in 2020 and hear verbatim what you heard back in 1980, 1990. And I understand why people do that. And I think that there is depth to it. And I think the deep part of that is the concept of subcultures and subcommunities, etc. But I'm a composer and I care about music itself and not the people involved so much. But from the perspective of somebody that cares about the music, I think this is bad. And I think that music has something to learn from mathematicians in that originality is not archaic. And it's not something that you just put in for the sake of trying to show off your creativity and things like that. I think that musicians get very scared of being too avant-garde and they want to reel it back to something real. But personally, I think that you can go too far in that direction as well. So there's an analogy that I have here, and it comes from a television show. And the television show is the famous anime Yu-Gi-Oh!, which I believe the card game came first. If anybody in the audience knows, please tell me. I think the card game came first, and then after that was the TV show. But there's a very particular episode that I want to talk about. Dan, could you just chuck up these 2 photos that I had prepared, please?
Sure, will do. On the next 2 free boards, all right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, just one moment.
Yeah, go for it. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Is based on a card game, but in this particular episode, I wrote down the name of the episode. It's episode 49, titled Miracle Dimension, Summon Black Magician. And inside this episode, there's a variation on the card game where the players have to roll dice, and they can only summon a monster if they can physically fit an unfolded Carnot map of the dice on the square grid, which is the board, right? So if you look at the photo on the right, you can see that Yugi is about to put down this dice and it's going to unfold perfectly if your mental geometry is good enough to see that this piece fits perfectly into the little pattern that is kind of outlined. I guess I can do it with my pen. That's going to go here. Wait a minute, does it take that final square as well? Yes, It's going to go like that. And the first photo is such a dramatic moment in the episode, and I never watched this show that much. I never liked it so much, but this is a point that has stuck with me for literally since I was a child. The entire game, people are putting down Carno maps like this. So this is the way that they are unfolding their dice onto the board. And there's no rule that means you have to do it in this particular way, but it's just kind of like these are the obvious ones. These are the ways to unfold the dice that people are most familiar with, and I'm sure as you play this game more, you get most familiar with these patterns. But the pattern sketched in the photo on the right is also valid, and it fits perfectly inside the board amongst what is around it. So the analogy here is think about the grid as the history of music, and think about the unfolded dice as particular compositions, right? Now, you can see that what is so beautiful about this particular play inside this game is Yugi was able to find the perfect piece that fits into the geometry of what is around it perfectly. And if he had done this on a space away from the board, away from the action, so imagine an infinite grid, and we'd done this very far away, then it would have been out of context and somewhat meaningless. And so it would have been difficult to understand what it really was that Yugi actually did. And had he done it over the top of other pieces, well, that wouldn't be allowed in the game. But what that would be inside our analogy is reproducing that which has already been done. And so it wouldn't fit in perfectly. Instead, it would overlap with what has already been created. So I think that this is such a good way to think about what counts as good creation. So this exists for mathematicians and it exists for musicians as well. The golden spot is to slot your creation in to the perfect point in history that slots in with that which is around it, but has yet not been discovered. Because what happens is after this play has been played, you look at it and you think to yourself, how did anybody not notice that, right? That was destined to be there, but nobody thought of it until this person did. That's the reason why it's such genius. It was a true moment of insight. And some of the musicians in the heavy metal community are absolutely doing this. There's Hunter Hunt Hendrix, who recently changed their name because they have transitioned, and that's really bad of me that I can't remember their transition name. Forgive me, ex Hunter Hunt Hendrix from the band Liturgy, which is the current band name, so you can just look that up. I think that she is a total genius, developing music that could have been written by Metallica in the 80s, but absolutely wasn't. And in such a way where you think, man, how did nobody do this before, right? And then you have the same thing with mathematics. So one thing that I was taught inside my master's is that writing a paper is not just producing mathematics, but explaining how it fits into the bigger picture. So research is meant to fit in with that which is around it. There are ideas inside this world, and how do they connect to each other, and how do they influence each other, and how do they fit in with respect to each other is an important part of research. So that's an analogy that I like a lot, and we can think about that. Okay. Part 2.1. Constraints and beauty. We have a quote. When the constraints become the description of the beauty, true art has been achieved. So let me explain what I mean by this. And I'm going to do this by way of example. So let me talk about another set of musicians, Bellwitch, absolute geniuses, of course, have an incredibly beautiful song called Mirror Reaper. And I think that the title of the talk is a lyric from this song. It's either a lyric or some guiding philosophy that they used inside the creation of their lyrics, but it was Bellwitch that constructed that original quote. Mirror Reaper is a soulful and mournful journey through the grief of two musicians who dedicate a portion of the song to their deceased close friend who was once also a member of the band. Now, this song is incredibly slow paced and it has every next section coming as a necessity to that which precedes it. It is noteworthy because this song is incredibly limited melodically. It's incredibly limited harmonically. It's incredibly limited rhythmically. It's incredibly limited instrumentally. In fact, only two musicians were required in order to perform the entirety of it. It's incredibly long. It's 83 minutes in length, and it's a single song. It is unmistakably metal. So let me put that word down, that controversial, scary word. And it's incredibly limited lyrically, considering its length. Okay, so let's have a look at this. See if you can try to imagine what this song sounds like if you've never heard it before. It's 83 minutes. It's massive. It is completely stripped. It's not completely stripped of melody, harmony, and rhythm, but it is so restricted. The melodic lines that you hear are very drawn out. There's only a tiny handful of them, and they're never given to you in the spotlight. They're never like right in front of your face. Here is the triumphant melody. There is absolutely nothing like that. Harmonically, it's the same. I mean, the whole thing is one incredibly drawn out chord progression. It's dooming and beautiful, but it's not harmonically rich. It's quite linear in its harmonic development. I would say there's basically no rhythm at all. There is one climax right toward the center where the drums pick up in some kind of definable pace, but there's a level of busyness that the drum kit is required to have before you can even distinguish a beat. And I would say that the drums avoid this the entire way through. But yeah, it's still definitely metal. So all of that seems to completely defy what we would consider metal, because you think of intensity and busyness and density and not these drawn out 83-minute long songs. So what does this have in it, right? My question is, if this is what it doesn't have, what is inside this thing? And my answer to that question is what is left is only the most difficult parts of musical composition. So I want to write some of these down. I'll jump down to the first board again. Oh no, I'll come over here. So we have atmosphere, we have mood, we have narrative, we have emotional communication, we have space, we have implication, and I can go on, etc. So I would say that this song is extraordinarily rich in all of these things. And all of these are very, very difficult in order to compose into a piece of music, let alone one that's 83 minutes long, and let alone one that holds as much attention as what Mirror Reaper does. So what's the point I'm trying to make? I'm not just fanboying here, although I am definitely doing that. The point is that I can't tell you what is beautiful about this piece of art without using exactly the same sentences that I used in order to tell you its restrictions, right? So think of this like a math problem. Imagine if we said, okay, we want to construct a song and it has to be 83 minutes long and it has to be metal and it has to have no rhythm, no harmony, no melody, etc. Then you would just think that it's impossible, or maybe possible, but you'd only end up with something stupid. Or at the very least, you would think, what could that be? right? I don't immediately have understanding of what that collection of axioms amount to. And then you hear Mirror Reaper and you say to yourself, that's it. That's 100% it. I have a complete understanding of that system, the system being the piece of being music which is defined according to those restrictions. You now understand it in full after hearing it. And so it defines these abstract axioms. And so we have achieved liftoff. These are no longer meaningless constraints. Instead, they are defining features of beauty. So I think this is the strongest link between mathematics and music, because in mathematics, you see this concept all the time. So the example that comes to mind is the fundamental theorem of abelian groups. And this basically reads that if A is an abelian group, then there exists R, an element of the integers, and there exists K1, which divides K2, which divides ... up to Kn, which is also an element of the integers, and an isomorphism, from A to Z to the power of R, direct sum Z K1, direct sum ... direct sum zk sub n. Okay, so this is an example of what we call in mathematics a structure theorem. It gives you the structure of a particular mathematical object. Now, what do I mean by the structure, right? I mean, that's kind of a totally ambiguous thing to say, and it's kind of a totally subjective thing to say as well. But the point is that to a mathematician, this is just undeniably the way that you want to think about abelian groups. And the point is that
finitely generated abelian groups.
Did I leave that out? Yes, I did. Sorry about that. Finitely generated. This is the way that we want to think about finitely generated abelian groups. And what do I mean by the way that we want to? It's artistic, right? And that's kind of my whole point. Like, we as mathematicians are like the rest of you, but we have some affiliation and affliction and affinity toward mathematics. And mathematics is the art of thought. So it's like, how do we want to think about these objects? I keep using this phrase, how do we want to? The point is, this defines something. A finitely generated abelian group is just a list of axioms, and mathematicians get made fun of for being interested in quote unquote random lists of axioms. But a theorem like this shows you that it's not random. The point is, this emerges into something. And so we have achieved that liftoff. So that which constrains the mathematical object becomes what defines its beauty as realized by this concrete theorem. So the direct analogy is the theorem is the song, and the axioms which define the mathematical object are the constraints which the song abides by.
Can I challenge this a little, Will? So,
go for it.
In the case of abelian groups, it's certain that this class of examples came first, and then the axioms came afterwards. So in a sense, it's rather opposite to your example with the song, because perhaps they started with those as constraints and then came up with something that fit those aesthetic constraints.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the reason why it seems that way is because I'm doing the same thing right now when I'm educating you about music that mathematics education does when it educates people about mathematics. It makes it sound like the story is, here are the constraints and then here's the theorem, here's the constraints and here's the theorem. But really it's the opposite way around. It's like, here are the examples, here's the theorem, and well, here's a theorem that we want, or this is the mathematical objects that we want to tie down, and then you construct the axioms from there. I would say that you have the same thing in music, where you are intuitively designing some creative thing, and then as you start doing it, there's an idea in there, but the idea is some like abstract, confusing thing, right? And the only one that really has access to it is the creator themselves, and they're intuitively bringing that idea out of them. And then through the creation, or before the creation, or after the creation, a list of like constraints that defines what that idea is becomes apparent. But you see this in both music and mathematics. So mathematicians do both as well. So sometimes you have a theorem and you say, what if I get rid of this hypothesis, right? So there you're really starting with the constraints, and then you're seeing where you can go, what kind of theorem you can generate. But there's also the opposite, which is we have these examples and we want to construct a mathematical object that behaves well. So how can we define that object in the most minimal way that still admits the structure? Or you're somewhere in the middle and you're kind of doing math, and then from that an idea emerges that you then eventually pin down. All of that exists inside music as well. So you might just start off creating something, and then what constraints it becomes apparent later. And then you can also have the thing where you concretely set out at the start, I'm going to do this, and then you try to do it.
Thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So although that exists in maths, I actually just think that strengthens the analogy, because I think that exists in music as well, creation of music. Okay, so I'm getting a bit short on time. I want to actually give you some help on writing music rather than just waxing lyrical about it the entire time. So let's move on to section 3. How to actually compose. So this is going to be more practical. What is a song? Music played through a speaker does not sound the same as music played through headphones. However, this does not create hesitation when the song is to be identified. Played out loud, through headphones, through car speakers, or even live by physical instruments, one quickly latches onto the sense of familiarity when the favorite song plays. A mathematician might say a song is identified up to natural equivalence, or something like this. As were the musician to play a wrong note at a non-crucial moment, it would be very dramatic in that moment to suggest that an entirely different song has been played. Let us now draw a distinction between a song and an instance of a song. Emotionally, it feels as though this settles the dispute. An instance of a song is the familiar concept, a recording on a CD, a live performance, a cover, etc. However, the excited energy, which pushes the concept of an instance of a song into clarity, simultaneously pushes the concept of a song into abstraction. The song becomes a theoretical object, and an instance of a song a physical realization of its platonic counterpart. So you kind of have this perfect platonic universe where a song exists as an idea, and then you have our ugly physical universe where a physical realization of the song exists in multitude, right? There are many different ways that you can physically realize a song. Where this becomes most interesting is in the mind of a composer. So how does one compose when what they create is not what they are driven by, right? So they are driven by a song, but they create an instance of a song. So there's kind of this complex thing. How do we create that which we are not driven by? The answer begins at a shift in perspective. One ought not forge a song, one not create a song, but instead one must raise a song. So you're driven by the platonic counterpart, and you're trying to give as greater physical justice to this as you can with the means that you have. So the important part is don't create, instead, due to lack of better word, raise. So a good test is to see whether what you created feels like it was somebody else, right? And there are many examples of this in life. Have you ever been at a party and you've told just an awesome joke and absolutely everybody laughed, including yourself, and it kind of comes to you in that moment? It doesn't feel like you created it. That experience is identical to somebody else coming in and telling the joke. It was just for some reason you, right? That's an example of raising an idea, because you kind of did it accidentally. It was done authentically. It was done in a semi-flow state. I don't know whether you can call that moment a flow state, but the ideal state for creation is flow, where the concept of self is most absent, right? I can tell you from my experience, my favorite song off my album Obdurate is Comic Book Channel. I adore this thing to pieces, and it's by far the one that I feel like I put least effort into, but that's so clearly not true because it's so clearly the most complicated one. Anyway, I remember the moment where I was lying in bed and I thought the album was basically finished, right? I had all of the songs and I was just about to start doing the production and everything. And then I literally just was drawn to my computer, and it was a super romantic moment. And I went, and just for 3 hours, I was totally not present and not aware of myself. And at the end of it, I looked at this thing that I'd composed and I was playing it, and I was genuinely having moments of like, oh, wow, that's really interesting because that does this and then that does that. Like, I'm analyzing it and I'm like, oh, so it kind of does this thing, etc. Right? So that is exactly how I talk about other people's songs that I find fascinating. It does not feel like I created it. Whereas, take like the counterexample is the track Legend of the Crocos, and that one is the most man-made piece of music ever. And I can feel every struggle and bit of my personality in every single second in that song. But I think that the goal is to hit that flow state so that it is equally as fascinating to you afterwards as it is anybody else. Okay, so the way that I write a song is, if I lost my pen, maybe my pen's out of battery. So let me charge that quickly while I keep talking. So concretely, what do? I start with a blank score, and I always start with piano. Now, I first started my musical life as a pianist, and that might be why. It doesn't really matter. I'll start with a guitar if you want, or whatever. But I do think piano is the best one. It's got a really nice mapping from the keys to the notes that you see on the screen. But I guess it doesn't really matter. I start with a blank score, and I write chords. So a chord progression is the most important thing. I cannot stress this enough. You can play block chords with no reasonable rhythm or melody associated to it in like terrible 8-bit crappy sound, even just pure tones. And if the chord progression is good, it will still make you feel something emotional. So you should spend so much time writing a really good, genuinely emotionally compelling chord progression. And once you've got a good one, there is basically nothing you can do to ruin that. After that, you're just going to be paying attention. Keep in mind what I said about raising a song as opposed to creating it. So just listen to it and ask yourself, what does it need? There's a quote from the drummer Metallica, write what has to come next. And I quite like this as well. You listen to it and you say, oh, okay, maybe it needs some drums to underline it. Maybe it needs a bit more movement. Maybe it needs some rhythmic embellishments or something. And the point is, think about yourself as a parent. So if you notice your child might like tennis, like, I don't know, you kind of look at them and you get to know your child and you're like, oh, maybe we should get them tennis lessons. Your duty as a parent is to go and get them tennis lessons. So you're the experienced one with knowledge of stuff in the world, and you offer it to your child and you let them authentically discover themselves through your influence. That's what you're doing with music, okay? So you as the mature one, you're meant to be saying, oh, maybe you need, maybe you need harmonic tempo variations, or, and whatever musical techniques that you're aware of. Maybe you need transposition, maybe you need inversion. And so you kind of offer it to the song and you do the experimentation and you observe and you see whether the song is happy or whether it's unhappy. See whether it fits authentically. And the result of this is that you end up with something that feels like it's not what you wanted to do at all, but what you've got is authentic, and you got there by truly listening as opposed to analytically thinking. So the summary is, by far the most important part is chords, and start there, and then listen. And that's it. That's all that I do. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's definitely going to get you started.
This doesn't sound much like mathematics to me. I mean, isn't there a large component of generative exploration and then kind of critical culling in any art, and including music? It isn't so much like that in mathematics, is it? I mean, the generative part, I mean, I guess you can come up with ideas for solving a problem that's generative in a way, but it's... I mean, I'm not a musician, so I don't know what it feels like, but do they feel similar to you?
It's a good question. So okay, let's remember another one of my favorite quotes. The interesting part of an equality is not how the two sides are the same, but how they're different. So sure, maybe we've established some relationships between the two of them. Now let's talk about some of the differences. One big difference is that mathematics is so focused on solving problems, right? Like you can write down the problem and you can say, let's solve this. And then you develop a theory that maybe goes ahead and does that. And that doesn't have such a great analogy over in music. I don't think that we're doing that in music so much. But what mathematics does have alongside solving problems is just kind of the creation of math, right? So you could decide that I believe in a future of like mathematical computer science or mathematical musicology or mathematical, I don't know, whatever you're so inspired by. And you believe that there is depth inside a particular concept that is not necessarily going to solve a problem if you were to explore, but you believe that you're going to get math out of it. And what do I mean by get math out of it? I mean, whatever you mean as math as the subjective artist, right? So follow that intuition and see if you can discover something. So that's the similarity for me, because I think that my work doesn't do so much for solving problems. So I believe in the concept of computation, and I believe that there is mathematics to be found inside there, and constructing concrete semantics for composition, as in composing functions, or composing morphisms inside a category, is not acutely going to solve a problem, but it's more we notice that there is something lurking there, and that something is only describable to an intuitive or by an intuitive mathematician. And as I go into there, I anticipate to find something, and I don't even know what that thing is, and it might not solve a problem. So that's the side of mathematics that I think is very similar to this. So the generation of content, and then the critical culling and the looking and the observing and the experimenting and seeing whether there is a there, and all that kind of stuff, that's the part that I think is incredibly similar. Yeah, but solving problems, I'm not sure if that's so analogous over on the music side. All right. I did have a couple of pieces of music planned, so I should cut to the point where I actually use that. So I spoke briefly about musical techniques, right? And I just said this out loud, but I said harmonic tempo. And harmonic tempo is the rate at which chord changes happen. And a famous example of this, or not a famous example, but a good example, is pop music, because what happens a lot is you'll have the chord progression for the chorus where the chord changes every bar. And then for the verse, you have the same chord progression, but it changes every 2 bars or something. So since it's changing every 2 bars, the harmonic movement is slower. You as the listener are receiving more less chord changes per second. And so the harmonic tempo is slower in the verse and it's faster in the chorus. And that extra movement of harmony helps give you that celebratory feel of a chorus. So I think that this is a really interesting musical technique. And it was one that I used, well, I noticed later that I used inside Comic Book Channel, the piece that I mentioned earlier. But I noticed that I had this interesting spin on it. So what we could ask is, what if we achieved variation in harmonic tempo, but maintained the number of chord changes per bar? maybe that doesn't need a question mark. So this is again one of those research directions, right? It sounds impossible. It's like I just defined it as the rate at which you receive chord changes. But if we maintain the number of chord changes per bar, then how can we achieve fluctuation in harmonic tempo? Well, that's where you start getting creative. We can change the tempo of the song from one bit to the next bit, and that means we're receiving more chord changes per second, but the number of chord changes per bar is maintaining the same. Or we can change the number of notes that are played inside a particular bar, so we can change the time signature. So what I have prepared is one section of Comic Book Channel, which is a bit lengthy. It's a little bit more than 1 minute, I believe. And then the next bit, which is basically a repeat of the harmonic ideas, but it's at a much quicker time signature. And what you want to pay attention to is that there is still the same number of chord changes per bar, but the harmonic tempo has definitely increased in the second version of it. And you'll notice that gives you a way higher sensation of intensity. So notice the difference in intensity between the first snippet and the second snippet. Okay, Dan, could you please play I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's going to be called
Comic Book
Channel like 1 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Just the first one. Okay, so that's the first section, and now can you play the second one, please? Okay, you can see that the second one occurs it's got such a shorter duration, right? But the same number of chord changes happened, and they happened at the same point with respect to the bars. It's just that 2 beats per bar have been removed in the second playthrough. And what's cool is to listen to that and decide what that does to the music and how you want to use that as a technique. Okay, I had lots more content, but I'm definitely going to have to leave it there. I'd be more than happy to do another talk if there was sufficient interest in me doing so, but I think I'm going to leave it there today because I'd like to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Will.
You're welcome.
Questions?
I like Ginger's question. I'm not sure if it's a question.
I was talking about enharmonic before. What does that mean? Anything?
So I think there are two terms, enharmonic and inharmonic. Inharmonic, what's enharmonic? Let's have a look. I'm getting the harmonic functions in mathematics. That's not thing I'm using. Yeah, this is more the technical side of music. So, all like the standing waves and the way that musical instruments create resonance and everything. So they're the harmonics of an instrument, and you can play with this as musical techniques. The guitar can do pitched harmonics, for example. That doesn't have anything to do with the concept of harmony as I was using it inside today's talk. But one thing that you can talk about is, what's it called? So it's inharmonic or something. I mean, inharmonic just means not harmonic, right? And so you can try to create good music with inharmonic ideas. And people have done some pretty clever things with that, especially in heavy metal, I would say, because if you don't have harmony, then what do you have? And then you create intensity, etc. Yeah, I don't think I can make anything
It's okay. We don't have to take the AI's question too deeply. Other questions for Will? How do you see that question, Will? Do you think it might be constraining? Yeah.
So I really want to give this like chord thing as a starting point. The reason why is because what is really crushing about getting to about composing music for the first time is just having a piece of music that sucks, right? And you've put so much effort into it, so much love and passion, but it's just bad. So a really good way to get yourself feeling good is to write a nice sounding chord progression. Because first, as I said, it's really difficult to kind of do something after that ruins it. So you're going to end up with something reasonable at the end. It'll make you feel good about yourself and it'll make you excited to keep composing. Two, one of the most complex parts of advanced music writing is harmony writing, so balancing complex harmonies, etc. And chord progression is like your first introduction to that. So writing chords is a concept which is easy to learn and difficult to master. So it's a very good entry point. It also depends on what type of musician you are. So some people like to start music with ideas and stuff like this. And I think that's legitimate because going back to the idea that you find a musical personality as part of your own personality, it probably means that if you're a musician, then the music is already inside you. You just have absolutely no idea how to communicate that yet. So starting with something else is probably not going to generate that music which is already inside you. So maybe a good starting point would be to connect with yourself first and then draw out some of these ideas and see if you can express them through your native instrument. I think vocalists have a particularly not easy, but they're calling vocals an instrument, it's the most amenable instrument to expression, is my opinion. So if you're a vocalist, you can just start by expressing your emotion with your instrument, which is your voice. And that can be a really good starting point as well. I think it's much more difficult to express yourself with like a drum kit, for example, although that also can be done. So yeah, it can definitely be restricting, but it's a very good starting point. So that's what I always suggest to beginners. If you're composing for the first time, start with chords. Anything else?
Maybe.
Yep.
I'm never sure if my microphone's gonna work. I have a question, so you're kind of like lamenting the fact that, chord progressions and like music can be somewhat non-creative or derivative across time periods. And so I'm wondering, like, what is the ultimate goal of music in your mind?
So that's a really good question. I think that we're artists and I think that we're generating art. And I just can't feel good about art that is completely derivative. Okay. So you could take influence and you can take inspiration, you can take an idea and do it in your own way and make your own personality out of it, etc. But I just don't believe that you've done art. I think you've done historic preservation. That's what I think you've done. If you take a piece of music and you reproduce, a style, you're not going to literally note for note reproduce it, but so what can happen is you accidentally get to a point where success becomes synonymous with, oh yeah, that sounds like the stuff I like, right? And that's a really dangerous headspace to get into, because you're just going to end up with mimicry if you let that part of yourself grow too much. So what do I think the point of music is? I think the point is to generate content, and the content that we're creating needs to be art. And what is art? Well, art is many things, but in part, it is the recording of the history of an artistic moment. And what is an artistic moment? Well, it's that mysterious place that is untouchable by science and logic that we call the flow state. So when you enter into that, you connect with something deeper, and you can bring that forward if you're attuned to be able to do so. And that artistic moment is beautiful, and the generation of such things is one of the points of music and art more generally. So I think that's my answer to that. That's a very good question.
So when you're talking about you could produce five people across 5 songs from 5 different places, 5 different times, are you speaking of plagiarists who have literally copy pasted that thing, or are you just speaking of they didn't search hard enough to verify that their thing was original? Could they not have just produced those things originally as well?
Yeah, I mean, maybe they did, but I somehow struggle to believe it if there's 5 of them across 5 different decades and they all sound like this super famous one from the 70s, right? So my point wouldn't be that they haven't searched enough to into the literature to verify that their album is able to be released in the way that mathematicians have to. My point is that those musicians haven't personalized it. And so it's not art, is my opinion. I haven't listened to something that encapsulates a part of yourself because it hasn't come from your personality. Instead, it's come from your experience of appreciating these particular sounds that you have managed to reproduce by yourself, right? So I think that the human experience is a crucial part of artwork, because I think the artistic moment is a crucial part of the artwork, and the artistic moment is man against this crazy universe that we live in, be it described by science or by art, right? So it's that mystical X place that we get to, and that is so deeply personal, and humans are different across each other, that there is no reason to believe that you're going to generate the same idea twice. I mean, that happens. Mathematicians do that, for example. So sure, that could happen. But I think it's more common inside music because there is this truly accidental thing that you can do where you start off with an instrument and everything that you do just sounds bad and bad and bad, and you try to write stuff and it sounds stupid, right? Until eventually you write this riff that in actuality just sounds like something that you like, and you think that what you've done is create something good. But you haven't created something good, you've created something else, right? And there's a big, big distinction between those two things. And if you are strict at disciplining yourself in that way, as you grow as an artist, then you can develop into something truly unique and genuine that is able to connect frequently with that flow state, and therefore true art. A lot of the time you can connect with that frequently, which is the goal. I mean, that takes years to get yourself to that point. So it's kind of like mental crime, like thought crimes or mental discipline. I think that's a big part of it.
So the AI was talking earlier about some book on architecture that it has access to. There was an interesting idea there about one of the things you experience. I mean, architecture, I guess, has a bit of similarity to music in the sense that it's kind of like, especially written music, is largely structural, and there's a lot of form to it. Maybe architecture is similar, but then you kind of animate it with life when you occupy it or play it. But in architecture, there's this effect of time, right, where a building is there for a long time and it's in the same place, and by being in it, you feel connected to the past. I guess your critique of and your desire for originality is maybe a bit of a rejection of that purpose of music, right? I mean, so what if you're just repeating the same songs? Isn't that part of the point, to connect you to the past?
Man, I'm conflicted on that, right? So you could take a classic album like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon or something, and you can hear what era that was recorded in, right? You can hear the snare, you can hear the vocals. Like, it is unmistakable what era that album was recorded in, right? And I think that is a really strong analogy to what you're talking about with architecture. Like, when it came out, it was brand spanking new, and everyone was like, "Oh my god, this is how clear and beautiful this sounds." And then you jump forward to 2020, and you're like, "Oh man, there's not even any auto-tune in this. What gives?" So you still have that concept, and that can be really beautiful to experience, and that's one of the benefits of that album. Another good example is King Crimson. King Crimson have albums from like the 60s and even earlier sometimes that are so full of that 60s sound, yet it's so forward thinking. It's so part of that artwork, the fact that it comes with the era that it was created in. The problem is that we have only recently learned how to record music, right? So we don't have recordings of Beethoven, and we don't have recordings of like the Psalms from the Bible, and that music has been lost, for example. And that's a massive shame. And that's the reason why, well, it's one of the reasons why we have these conservatoriums of music that do just reproduce the way that Mozart himself would have played this piece and the way that Beethoven himself would have played this piece. So sure, I can see legitimacy to that. I think that you've abstracted the musician from that, though, which is not a bad thing, right? So it's like you've got the piece of music, and maybe Beethoven, if it's a piece by Beethoven, then maybe Beethoven is connected to that piece of music, but the next guy at the conservatorium that plays it in exactly the way that Beethoven would have, that guy is not really relevant, right? It's like the piece is relevant and Beethoven is relevant, and he's just done a very good job at reproducing it. So yeah, you get that historical perspective, and that's legitimate. I think that there's a difference between that and just creating a new song that sounds totally like Beethoven. It literally could have just been written by Beethoven, even though it's not literally one of Beethoven's songs, and then going out and producing it and performing it and claiming that you're an artist, etc. Look, I'm very bitter toward that side.
I think I'm making a deeper critique of that. So, I mean, you think of music as primarily perhaps a creative enterprise, an exploratory enterprise, but you could take a different view, which is arguably a much older view, where music probably for our ancestors didn't change for tens of thousands of years, and it's like 99.99% about the social aspect, the kind of cultural aspect that you referred to at the beginning of this talk, but maybe a little bit dismissive towards. Is that not most of the value of music, like helping to form communities of people?
Okay. You're completely correct that I'm overly dismissive of this. I allow myself to be a little bit for a number of different reasons. I have an opinion that it's important to be opinionated in artwork, because what you reject is just as important as what you accept in the creation of your own artwork. Anyway, I'll try not to say too much about that. But since music is a creative and explorative thing for me, I don't hold back internally from letting that just be what music is. Like, what else could it be, right? And then in an academic and intellectual and mature mindset, I can sit there and say, oh yes, there is also this other side of music that brings people together and develops communities, and there's also the practical side of music.
The tone of your voice is so so contemptuous, but okay, yeah, good.
This is kind of my point, right? It's like I I unashamedly, strongly represent the creative, explorative dimension of music, to the point where that's so conflated that I struggle to see what else there is. And I understand that it's there, but it's so not my interest that I struggle to even perceive it as music. It's like other stuff to me. To me, that's some. So what is pop music? I think pop music is the generation of industries and companies. And then what is the reproduction of music inside small venues? I think that's the generation of subcultures and communities, and also that has impact on broader community and culture. So it's not really like music in my perception. It's more like it's a component of this complex thing, which I would refer to as subculture and subcommunity, etc. So I have this like slip in my mind into the identification of music and creation and exploration, etc. And that's why I represent that side of it so strongly. The other side of it is deep and there's interesting stuff in it. It's just not where I lay my hat, so to speak.
Okay,
but I don't think it's the most important part of music. So you suggested that that's the most important part of music, and I would disagree with that. I would say that it has a very tangible relationship with music, where what can I see in the world that music has done for me? And it's like, okay, this person wears tattoos and has piercings and has a shirt that says Slayer on it. That's something I can see that music did, right? And if I go to this venue, I will hear these sounds.
I think you're trying hard to not see the value in the other side. But all right, there was some other question. I think I have another one, but
well, there seems to me to be a strong tension in your thought between the Platonic / the ideal and the original instantiation. One thing you might consider in this regard is that repetition itself can become an act of creative freedom. And I think I saw certain aspects of your discussion that could take you down that path. And then another suggestion I have is that in focusing on the original, you're also highly focused on the authentic and everything that belongs to that ideation. So a philosopher I might suggest for you to open up this discussion is named Michael Hewitt, and I left a link in the other server on the Discord.
The Discord server?
Yeah, for you, so you could look at that, and it might help you a little bit going in that direction.
All right, great, thanks. So I think that repetition and recreation is an important part of coming to understand yourself. I still draw a distinction between releasing that thing, right? So it's like, I would see it like a mathematician solving an exercise in Hartshorne and then trying to publish that. It's like, what are you doing, dude? We've all solved that problem. Like, you haven't done anything, right? So solving that problem inside a textbook is a really important part of developing into a full-fledged mathematician. But it's not the same as being a full-fledged mathematician. But I appreciate the suggestion. Michael Hewitt, you said. We'll definitely read into it.
I'm not sure I follow you, Will, though, because you are undoubtedly doing mathematics when you do that exercise, and like there is value in that, right? Like the same as there is value in the repetition. It's still mathematics. It's still music. It's still good. It's just not the best. It's like doing mathematics isn't publishing mathematics.
Yeah. But there is something like real about publishing anything, right? If you are publishing something, you've really gone out on a limb and you've really been confident and you've gone up to the world and you've said, hey, I have done something that you all should listen to. Like, it's kind of an arrogant position to take. And also, in a world like music, man, like, we don't need more albums. We just don't need more albums. So if you're going to throw another one on that monolith of a pile, then it better be worth doing that for, right? And so I think that the journey towards becoming a musician that is capable of authentic creation, and similarly for a mathematician, is a beautiful journey. And there's a lot to discuss there. You can talk to your friends about it, talk to your family about it. You can host colloquiums where you discuss that with other people. But the production of what gets created on your path toward authentic creation is not the same as original authentic creation, is the way that I would look at it. You're still doing mathematics for sure. So like solving that problem, if you did that on your own, that's definitely in you performing mathematics, and you creating something musically on your own, even if you're trying to produce something that already exists and you're trying to work out how to do that. And so you do that and you pull that off. You've definitely still done music, but the closer to the authentic self that you are during the creation of music, the more musical you are being, is my contention. And simultaneously to that, the more connected to the authentic self you are whilst you create, the more original your music is going to be. I think it's very difficult to create unoriginal music if you were truly authentic when you did that, even if you tried to reproduce something else. So if you're like, what's my version of that? It would actually be difficult to completely reproduce it if you were genuinely close to the true self as you did that, right? There are heaps of other questions. Let's see if I can knock some of these over. So why do you pursue music as opposed to something like visual art? Because I suck at visual art, man. So I think that you don't get to decide what type of artist you are, right? And you can feel this. Like when I try to do visual art, maybe I can produce something, but Jesus, man, my sense of aesthetic is weak. I don't feel intuitive toward it. And I can just kind of like give it to somebody who is very intuitive in that way, and they make changes to it where as soon as I see it, I'm like, oh, it's just clearly so much better. I never would have thought to do that. It just feels like I'm not that type of artist. So I love visual art, and I wish that I loved it even more. It's kind of an art form that I want to like become part of. But I think that, again, it's this true self thing. Like at the end of the day, I seem to be a musician, and I seem to be, at least in part, a mathematician, but I don't really seem to be a visual artist.